This is Critical Nonsense, our high-lowbrow show about culture, science, and tech. This week, Aaron asks us about dopamine culture.
Woo!
I've been around the world, nah. This is Joey talking.
Yes, this is an Aaron talking like Anita Baker. That's the best that I could do. You really threw me, Joey. I did not expect you to go there, so I had to go a little deep. I had to really think about that one. Thank you for letting me dig in.
And this is what an executive producer and queen of disco, Jess Vander, sounds like.
Hi, this is Jess.
You know, I just want to circle back to Anita Baker just for a second. She's amazing. And do we remember who sang "Been Around the World"?
Well, we're gonna look it up right now.
We are. It's in my music.
Lisa
device.
Stansfield.
Lisa Stansfield. Thank you. Thank you.
Stansfield.
Such a good. Just that. That was good. I'll tell you what. That cleaned my house. That did it in and of itself. And I'm just jumping right ahead into that. I don't know if do we have any housekeeping? Do we have any musical housekeeping? I don't know. Oh, reset your algorithms. That'll be my housekeeping message for everybody. Like, make sure that you just mix up your music so you get something new on the way in. I was just suggesting.
And you say,
Thank you for saying.
The house is already
Welcome.
clean.
Indeed. She went to Brown, and I love her. Lisa Loeb, class of like 92, forever. And yes, Jess, I'm happy to have cleaned this house, but also specifically to have reminded everybody you're in control of your algorithms, which, for what it's worth, is where I kind of was hoping to take us today. I've been inspired by something that I believe y'all have been inspired by as well. And I'd love to bounce around with you. Is that cool? Is that reasonable?
Yes.
Cool.
Yep.
So the other day, our dear friend Gretchen Devereaux, friend of the pod.
That could have been a podcast title too. So the other day.
The other day, it's true. We'll remember this. So Gretchen Devereaux, strategy director here at Sylvain, dropped a note from the Sat Post Substack, I believe it is, by
Trung Fan.
Trung Fan, and it's just one graphic that I think set the conversation at Twitter. And the focus of it was really around this notion of dopamine culture. The premise of which being that the rise in digital platforms like Spotify or TikTok or Hinge or pick your poison, plus the proliferation of smartphones, has led to really quick dopamine hit payoffs for a lot of activities that used to have longer experience cycles to them. And more specifically, one of the nefarious outcomes of that is that it optimizes the doom. All of these things are optimized to facilitate a doom loop where you are getting hits of dopamine super, super fast, and then you just feel this depression, this chasm, this anxiety that just comes afterward. And we can get into some specific examples after the question, but what I wanted to sort of throw out there for us is, how do we survive dopamine culture?
Just as a little contextualization, since in the audio format you can't see the graphic, it's taking sort of like arenas like Aaron was saying and comparing slow traditional culture to fast modern culture to then dopamine culture being like the inevitable acceleration, like exponential acceleration. And so like one example is in, it says athletics, play a sport, watch a sport, gamble on a sport as that progression, or in video, it's like film and TV, then online video, then reels of short videos, albums to individual tracks to TikToks, etc. That was sort of the progression. And I think, I mean, do you feel like, I'm trying to like figure out how to, I feel like people are actively pushing back on this, but I don't know if that is like a bubble thing for me as like a person of a certain age, or if that is like true elsewhere. Like, I feel like the distaste in smartphones is like rising, and people are starting to like actively try and change behaviors. I've had multiple people this week talk to me about deleting many of these apps off their phone that are like wildly different age cohorts, like Gen Z and like a senior executive in his late 50s at a company, both saying almost exactly the same phrase. And so I'm like, are we pushing back against dopamine culture? Are we like accepting that it's happening, or is there going to be like a pendulum swing? Like, I don't know.
I mean, one of the things that I sort of wonder is about intentional management of our own consumption.
Mm-hmm.
I think that, we over the past 10 to 15 years have just experienced like, oh my God, it's so much easier. Like, I don't have to think about the music that I want to listen to. The music just happens. The next TV show I want to watch, I don't have to think about what happens. And admittedly, I will candidly say that I believe that I feel like I'm old man shakes fist at, sky and cloud when it comes to this. Because I don't romanticize, but I do appreciate having a CD rack and thinking intentionally about what I want to listen to and what mood I want to be in, as opposed to, as I said at the top of the show, falling prey maybe, or just like letting myself go and just go on music stories that other people are taking me through. But more specifically to the point of thinking about what we're doing, when it comes so fast and it feels so good, it's very difficult, I find, to just stop and slow down, to think about it. And I think that perhaps this, like, maybe some of the conversations that you've been having are evidence that people are just more aware that this is not a fundamental or intrinsic good to go into sidecar mode, but actually you get something different out of it when you either make big decisions to not engage as much and or simply like modulate where it's going to and when it's going to add value to you. But Jess, I'm really curious. The listeners can't see the wheels turning in your eyes, but you've got some eye wheels turning, and I want to drive the motorcycle. Tell us more.
Eye wheels, in a way, are like disco balls. Only
I love it. I love it. I love it.
I admit my first thought was, I don't know enough about dopamine, the chemical messenger, and its other siblings, which in a very cursory layperson's traversal of the internet will unearth some of dopamine's sibling neurotransmitters, like histamine. Actually, if you take an allergy pill, that's an antihistamine, which is basically just like the reactive functions, and other. Yes, Joey.
Well, I was just gonna say that like the simple handle for dopamine is just like reward, like it in like reward pathways. So like search and you find something and it's good. It's like it does more than that, and everything is more complex than one word. But like that's the rule of thumb around it.
Well, it does surface something. Oh, go for it, Jess.
Well, I think that the reason that I was going down this path to understand the sort of, or at least attempt to understand some of like the biological drivers, is that I guess I'm trying to decide whether uh, like the question of whether it is inevitable that certain things in our culture, technology, etc., are moving towards like what may on the surface look like a biological optimization problem of like, cool, like this thing is good, or like if the really shorthand fool's definition of dopamine is like the reward or pleasure neurotransmitter, like, okay, sure, yeah, more of that, right? That sounds good. So I think that's why I'm um, trying to it's difficult to participate not knowing hardly anything about this, but being so interested in sort of like what is our uh biological agency or lack thereof in being drawn towards things that make us feel good.
Like, of course, like, you know, you're going to have interactions that are going to trigger dopamine in everyday life naturally. I think where the issue comes in is in things that sort of potentially hijack the system where you're and start to create like addictive loops in this, right? Like when people talk about likes on Instagram or other platforms of like that quick hit of like, oh, someone liked my post or commented, I want to get more of that. Like these sort of neurotransmitter pathways were not designed to contend with social media. They were designed to be like, I found berries in a bush and they taste good. You know, like you're not like, okay, I'll go find more berries, but I'm not going to get my like system hijacked in that same way. You know what I mean?
I think that this also surfaces, and what I hear in some of what you're saying too, Jess, is like there's a metaphor here. And the question is like, is it a metaphor or is it biologic fact? Like, is dopamine culture a really good handle to describe a broader phenomenon that's mostly about like instant gratification and less so about the physiological hijacking of those pleasure centers? And like, admittedly for myself, maybe I'm going too far down that road. Like sometimes this is why these things are sticky and insightful, is like the metaphor helps sort of play around with it. But I do think that the conversations that are happening in congressional bodies in Europe and a little bit in the US too are really talking about the physiological impact of this and the actual and practical parallels that start to emerge when it comes to addiction that can come from engaging with content in this way. And I think that another layer that is probably the most challenging layer is the social media aspect of many of these, or not even social media aspect, just the social aspect that like when we worry, I think a good example or an interesting example to me is just, slow traditional culture was handwritten letters, which then moved to like voice memos and email. And now there's texts. And we could even extrapolate that out. Like the dopamine culture example that that's used is short texts. And when there's a social aspect to it, similar to the fact that we're not supposed to wander through bushes running into berries every nanosecond, the idea that you are immediately available and engaged in every conversation, no matter how fragmented or fractured, at the drop of a hat is very unsettling. Or is not something that in theory these internal systems that we have were optimized for. So like, I'm a very big fan. This is where I'm old man shaking fist at cloud. I've always been kind of working or pushing against these in really practical ways. So like, for example, I don't have notifications on my phone for virtually anything. Like I have to turn them off. The only things that I think I get notifications for are texts, the Ring doorbell, which is in and of itself a problem, and watering my plants through my plant app. I highly recommend that. Although even that's a little bit anxiety inducing. Similarly, on like laptops and stuff, I keep my notifications off most of the time. Also, my computer likes to turn them off for me, which is sort of a benefit and a horrible thing at the same time. But I can't handle chats. Chats are my nightmare. because I cannot think about anything when a chat comes through. Then it's like, oh, what's the chat? And then I've got to scroll through that entire history of the chat. And it turns out like, oh, it's just about a cat. It's just about a cat. It's about someone's cat. I don't, this is not urgent for me. But I do, so like kind of going on with this, I think it's really healthy and a good thing that people more broadly are taking steps or really considering what the impact of these things are. And I think a practical one that came up in conversation within the company is like, you know, leaving your phone in your car while you go walk your dog, or leaving your phone behind while you do a quick dog walk. So you're forced not to have all of those notifications in a moment that could otherwise be a moment to slow down. And of course, that's a luxury that, or maybe not a luxury, but like a very specific behavior that not everybody can do. But I do think it is essential to pay attention to how a culture optimized for speed and attention grabbing has negative effects on you, and to recognize that you have authority and agency in managing some of that. Not all of it, but some of it.
I think all of this is helping me crystallize the thing that is floating around in my disco ball wheel eyeballs, which is the inherent contradiction of the reward of the reward, right? Because the base idea is, hey, there are these things that are increasingly driving us to prioritize reward, but that is either ethically or rationally not actually pleasurable in the macro sense somehow, right? Like that maybe in this moment or in the short term or in some narrower context, yes, it does feel like a positive thing, but that in a more macro, in a longer term, in a rational context, that it is actually not pleasurable, right? Like the withdrawal that someone might experience, or like your fear of like, oh, I can't. That is sort of the macro response of like, at that moment, it felt great to look at these things, and now I can't get rid of it, and now I regret everything. And I found there's an article from a bunch of years ago that I just pulled up about, like, you know, I'm sure greater details about like why scientifically or biologically we are inclined to prioritize the short-term reward versus that like macro long-term thing. But it also it's tied up in I think like another interesting related point that I'm just like I'm rewatching The Good Place, and maybe it's like getting me too much on this like philosophy track, but it's just also making me question the like you can't deny that a big part of this is sort of like the was it moral or ethical? I can't remember which is the right word to use here, but like the ethical moral superiority of like, well, the rational brain though is better, and so like if you were able to manage yourself better, like you would be able to control those short-term pleasure responses. I just like I can't help but take myself straight to this place of how is it that we are all finding ourselves in this place where we are completely controlled and like responding to that short-term reward system. How can it be that bad if that is like all of our natural inclinations? Like how much of this is a turmoil that we've put ourselves in of like what we should be doing? I don't know if I agree with that, but like that's the challenge that I'm posing for myself. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, the interesting thing that it makes me think about as you're talking about it is, yes, I think there is a moral aspect to this that I think is sort of important to, Sheryl Crowe said it best, if it makes you happy, it can't be that bad. But I think there's a lot of data that is suggesting that maybe these things are not making people happy, right? Out in that longer term non-immediate sense, right? Like if I eat a bunch of candy, it tastes good, but I will have a crash, or my body won't be as healthy, or whatever it is. And I think what is interesting to me as you were talking about it is the seeking behavior, like in some fundamental way, at least in sort of the specific pathways that we're talking about in terms of reward with dopamine, and to Aaron, your point about like putting like at least like a moniker metaphor handle on this thing. The seeking behavior is like you going out and finding reward when you're not getting it enough. And when these things are coming directly to you and isn't necessarily like a choice that you're making of like, is this what I want right now? My body is just like dopamine, 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 scroll a TikTok or scroll Instagram or, or go on DraftKings for betting or whatever the source that in this like dopamine culture, or, go on Tinder or one of the apps and look for a person. It's not giving you the opportunity to generate motivation, which forces you to then think about how in which you want to satisfy that like lack of dopamine, a lack of a reward. And it makes me think of like the sort of WALL-E example, which is like narrow in what it's used, but like the idea that like people just sit on those floating chairs and like food and content and everything is sort of fed into them. That is like a hyperbolic extreme outcome in this scenario where you're never seeking because it's always coming to you. And I think, the idea of like finding your motivation and discovering where you want to get the reward or which version of the reward that you like can be a thing that becomes identity forming, right? That helps you understand yourself better and like where you get bigger or more interesting rewards versus like stacking up tiny little blocks. You can get the feeling of having like a larger scale reward by finding a thing that makes you, takes more effort than scrolling TikTok. Maybe you have to climb a mountain or arbitrary example, but like that can create some sort of larger scale reward that has a higher peak, even though it takes more effort to achieve it,
The like type 1, type 2 fun concept. You heard of this?
No, I haven't heard of that.
Yeah, can you say a little bit more of that?
Yeah. So my friend was joking. She was like, on my dating profile, I put like looking for someone who likes type 2 fun. And I was like, what is that? And she was like, oh, type 1 fun is a thing that is actively fun while you're doing it. Like, oh, I love bowling. I don't know. So something that's like super awesome for you. But type 2 fun is a thing that while you're doing it may be very grueling, maybe very like objectively unpleasant. But after you're like, wow, I'm really glad that I did that. Or I'm like really proud of myself. Like for her, that's going through the Noel's like winter training where she had to like live in igloos and ice storms. Oh, I'm doing like a horrible job at like describing how unbelievably arduous this experience was that she went through, but she's like a mountaineer and does all kinds of super active things. And I think that that idea of like,
what's fun for you, the Iditarod?
Yeah, he's right. Just like going through something like very, very difficult, physically, emotionally, all of those types of things. Something that you can look back after and be like, I did that.
Yeah, and like, ironically, coincidentally, my dear friend Whoopi Goldberg on The View has been talking about this ad nauseum for the past few weeks in relationship to democracy and voting, and that, she doesn't put it in these words. Whoopi kind of cuts straight to the core of things. But the idea that youth culture, which is very connected to dopamine culture, has as a result set unreasonable expectations about the speed at which positive outcomes are achieved. And so ultimately, in the context of voting and democracy and change, it's a long and arduous and tedious process. And it's in complete conflict and contrast with you go and you send a text and you get a response, or you go into TikTok and you get a laugh, like, and it only takes 15 seconds and you're done. And all of this, though, there's another thing that sits alongside it that I think we're talking about, and I love this quote. It always, or not quote, but this idea that anything can be a poison or medicine depending on the dose. And so it's not that anything is inherently one thing or another. It's about how much you use it, for what reason you're using it, and are you monitoring your consumption of it? And I think connected to that is, it came up, we talked about it just a little bit, but like, we do live in a Puritan society. The morality overlay is really strong. And interestingly, I think a lot of these things sit in an amoral bucket right now, whereas we would have the same conversations about alcohol or drug use, where it's like, oh yeah, look, you can make an argument that a little bit of this thing may not be that bad, but too much, oh my God, you're a bad person. But people have fitness addictions, and people have all sorts of addictions that may be colloquially seen as more socially acceptable and not as morally charged. But ultimately, regardless of what it is still having that same question, or still presents the same question of, how much am I consuming of this? And at what point is it no longer serving me? And or is it sending me down a bad path?
The deadly sins component is really interesting right? Like, often fitness addictions can be oriented towards vanity, and this conversation maybe is a little bit more oriented towards like slothfulness, even in what I was talking about in seeking, right? Like, versus letting it come to you, or, you know, gluttony and some of like the alcohol conversation, right? Too much, or like overconsumption, whatever it is. It like, I think that like is making me think a lot.
And it creates, I think the biggest challenge is that, you know, in the world of digital services that we're talking about, it literally connects to anything. So it's like, if you want a drink right now, you can go on DoorDash and get a drink within 15 minutes. Well, it's going to take longer depending on where you live. But you know what I mean? Like, it actually can connect to any one of those mortal sins. And it actually represents almost like the kaleidoscope of all of them, which could perhaps make it more dangerous than anything else, and require more temperance than anything else, which is very weird, though what we're really talking about is social media temperance, or content temperance. But anyway, I think that this might have led us into the wrap-up corner. I'm just doing that because we gotta go temper some other things too. So I'm curious, Jess, how much you wrap us up.
Whoopee.
Oh boy. Should we just slide straight to Joey's wrap-up corner? I feel like I'm not going to do the right justice to this, other than, I feel like this one really got to me, Aaron.
Joey, wear your wrap-up hat. Where's your wrap-up hat? Wrap-up hat.
Think about the places where you're putting your dopamine. I think if it makes you happy and if you feel good about it, remove the morality. Maybe that's an okay place to put your dopamine. But if it's not bringing you joy, like Marie Kondo, sweep out your brain and give yourself some space for seeking in the places in which you would like to seek.
Hold your phone in your hand. Does this bring you joy? If not, chuck it out the window.
Yes.
Hold every app in your hand.
In your hand.
Yes.
TikTok.
Yes.
It's Instagram.
Yes.
Critical Nonsense is a Sylvain production.
Brought to you by nothingness. You have space to think. I swear this emptiness is filled with joy. And not apps. Bye-bye now.
As always, we'd like to thank our executive producer and large format acetylcholine, Jess Vander.
We'd also thank sound engineer and the Sarah to my tone in Alex Contel.
We'd like to thank executive producer and GABA receptor, Les Jacobs.
And you know what? I call them my left brain, my right brain, but they really are that chasm that holds both halves together that I can't remember the name of, but one of you probably does right now.
Corpus callosum.
Thank God. The corpus callosum of this podcast. Nora Mestrich. And sorry, Gilbert. Thank you for all that you do.
And as always, thanks, Elen. Special thanks to the words gyrus and sulcus and gyri and sulci. I just like those words. Brain words.
God, brain words. I would also like to thank brain words. That just seems like a good thing to jump onto, so I'm glomming on.
Hey, I would love to thank brain words.
There it is. There it is. Spike it. Set it. Sell it to the butcher in the store. Yes.
Oh, you all are the nicotinic and muscarinic receptors to my acetylcholine system, bringing me peripheral and central nervous support.
God, Joey, we get it. You were a neuro major. You're literally a neuroscientist.
Yeah, we get it.
Cool.
I'm not a scientist,
Cool.
but now
Oh,
because we've had this
jeez.
conversation, I just have the flow of words cycling through my brain.
It's okay. I'll just talk about 1950s immigration reform. That's all I got. It's not.
Sodium channels.
All right, friends. Have a good one.
Love you, mean it. Bye.
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 And Les Jacobs. And Les Jacobs. I think. Did I leave
And
out Les
Les-
Jacobs? Did I?
No,
leave
I
Les Jacobs?
did
You
less.
got Les
I did
Jacobs?
less. We're
No,
good.
you did
Yeah.
less, but then you said then you called.
I messed it up,
executive
right?
Producer, but like, let's be no. Joey did it right, but then
Programming
also Joey did it
coordinator.
but also like technically also fair, true.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
really.
Legit.
Yeah.
Legit.
Anyway, just roll
Yes.
roll it back. Just roll it back.